There's a lot of forces working against somebody with an eating disorder. There's the genetics, there's the epigenetics, there's the environment, there's exposures that have occurred throughout their lifetimes, there's exposures that have occurred through parents' lifetimes, both mom and dad. There has to be this interdisciplinary approach to metabopsychiatric diseases like anorexia to really get to the bottom of this and be very effective.
Welcome back to the Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie Quinlan, and today I am so excited to share a conversation that I had with a brilliant, beyond brilliant scientist and researcher, and also a very, very close friend who is going to talk to us about all of the interactions between our minds, our guts, our bodies, our bones, when we have eating disorders, and also when we start to recover from them. So what are the implications on our systems? Things like our genetic markers, things like the ways that we impact our future offspring by the decisions that we're making today. So I had my thinking cap on for this entire conversation. So I would recommend you do the same. I learned a ton. I think you will too. And so I'll tell you a little bit about the brilliant Faye. So Dr. Faye Chleilat is a postdoctoral research fellow at Stanford University School of Medicine in the Department of Genetics in Dr. Mike Snyder's lab. She completed her Master of Science in Nutrigenomics at the University of Guelph in southwestern Ontario before moving cross-country to start her PhD in Dr. Raylene Reimer's lab at the University of Calgary, specializing in genetics, nutrition, and metabolism. So in addition to this and all of that brilliance, she also loves to travel, hike, play golf, and is a devoted Raptors fan. So without further ado, my conversation with Dr. Faye Chleilat. So Faye Chleilat, welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Maddie. This is amazing. I'm so excited for this podcast. I'm so proud of you.
Oh, thank you. It's been really good. And I have been so excited to talk to you because we are going to just learn so much today. And your bio is absurd. It's like there are words in your bio that I don't know at all. And so we're about to get schooled on some very, very real stuff. But I wanted to just start off with, maybe you could tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and then how you got into the field that you are in.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I just started my postdoc at Stanford University. I'll give you a bit of background before. So I did my PhD at the University of Calgary in Alberta, and my specialty there was early nutritional programming during different periods of life with a focus on, programming essentially is how things are altered, specifically on chemical tags that attach to your gene that can turn things on or off so that they show either more prevalently or they're much more dimmed or they're not shown at all. So as an example, we can give the example of obesity. Obesity, you see very different body types around the world. Not everybody is one set BMI or one set body composition. You're going to see variability. And so that's that dimming switch. And so these are things that I focus on during my PhD with a specific manipulation with nutrition. So how can I manipulate nutrition at an early time period? So that early time period could be during lactation, so when mom is breastfeeding, or actually even before conception, so before even baby is conceived. So that's during dad's experiences before that period as well.
Oh, wow. So how do the things that happen to humans before they're born impact their actual long-term lifetime outcomes?
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the things that I like to focus on are the epigenetic marks. So those are that chemical tags that facilitate that dimming switch, but also the gut microbiome, which is a very hot topic. So that's that bacteria, viruses, fungi, archaea that live in our guts. They also live all over the body, all on every surface, virtually every surface. But I typically focus on the gut.
Oh, that is so cool. And so perfectly relevant to hopefully what we're going to talk about today. Because eating disorders are different in that they're a mental illness, but the impact that they have on our physiology and our biology is huge. And even though we know that eating disorders are not just about the food, they really are also in a lot of ways about the food and the ways that we mess around with it and how that impacts us and our health. And so it's terrible, it's complicated, and there's such a connection between our brains and our bodies and our food. And so maybe you can tell me a little bit about the physical and metabolic aspects of the human body that might be impacted by someone who's restricting or developing an eating disorder.
Yeah, totally. So this is a great question, and it's absolutely highly relevant. So when it comes to eating disorders, now they're actually considered of metabo-psychiatric origin. So metabolism and psychiatric, not just one or the other, which I think has been a misconception for a long time that it's all entirely psychiatric, but it's actually a mixture of both, with a very, very high linkage with genetics. So I think for a long time, people assume that, it's just the psychiatric aspect of it. But researchers are actually saying that anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, as well as binge eating disorder, which are the three different eating disorders that people discuss primarily. Their genetic influence ranges. So when we're going to talk about mostly anorexia nervosa, just because when it comes to metabo-psychiatric origins and these diseases, researchers mostly speak about anorexia nervosa, or I'm just going to call it anorexia from here on out. And there seems to be a 50 to 60% genetic association with anorexia nervosa. So it cannot be dismissed as, just psychiatric. There is a great linkage there as well.
Whoa. So you're saying that 50 to 60% of like the correlation is genetic in us, that we didn't just choose this basically, or we just didn't want to be skinny. It's like we are predisposed to this on a genetic level.
Totally. And a metabolic level as well. So there's been research that has been coming out. It's actually really, really exciting research that came out. So this idea of, it is of genetic origin kind of started in 1991. So there's been epidemiological twin studies. So twins are kind of our best subjects to use for things like when we're looking at genetic origin. They don't really look at the molecular side of things, but they definitely can elucidate a lot of genetic information for us. And so we've actually used these twin studies in 2019, a really great paper that was published in Nature Genetics, which is a really, really great journal. It's an impact factor of 38, which is really good. Really, really
I'm
good.
like, what is an impact
Yeah.
factor of 38? It sounds impressive.
So like the best journals in the world are generally, especially in the basic sciences realm, it's Nature, Cell, and Science, and they range within like 40 to 42, and Nature Genetics is 38, which is exceptional. So they actually found 8 loci, which are specific regions on chromosomes that are directly linked with this predisposition to have anorexia. So, and they've also implicated from these 8 risk loci, metabo-psychiatric origins as well. So I'm going to paint a picture. So
Yeah.
when we refer to genes themselves, they don't just do one or the other. They're not just, black and white. Everybody's read Harry Potter. There's maybe like 3 people in the world that haven't read Harry Potter.
It's okay.
So in the first book, Harry Potter gets those cards, the frog cards. Do you remember those?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, and he looks at it and he's like, whoa, he's moving around. He gets Dumbledore, and then Dumbledore disappears and he's shocked. And Ron goes to him, well, you can't expect him to hang around there all day. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the same thing. Like these pictures in the wizarding world, they jump from their one picture to another, and they communicate with each other, et cetera. There's a lot of overlap and interplay. And that's kind of the same thing with genes. There's a lot of interplay with different things. So what we're finding with these twin studies is that specifically with this paper, this awesome paper, that there's these overlaps with various things, including glycemic index, there's like lipids, anthropometric traits, so body composition, and insulin as well, like insulin resistance, etc. So a lot of really cool overlap linked to these genes, which is really cool. And it also really provides us with more information for treatment in the future.
Okay. Okay.
Mhm.
And so then how does that play into how anorexia develops and then its ultimate impact?
So totally. So that's a great question. So when we talk about anorexia, it's very heterogeneous. So it's not one reason, one thing leading to another. So there's a lot of risk factors that people talk about. The origins is that it's within the family, and that, it's the environment. So abuse, a lot of people talk about sexual abuse, which is very common and something that needs to be, discussed as well. Also, avoidance coping mechanisms, there's low social support, perfectionism,
Mm.
environment or that's needed. There's also, maybe weight concerns or comments given by parent figures that also has some influence. So those environmental factors do have a significant influence. The more significant influences are the very, very major ones, like, for example, sexual abuse. So that can actually in turn have a very negative impact on something called the epigenetics, which can not only be processed throughout our own lives, but they can be inherited by our children and the children after that. So when we talk about epigenetics are, I touched on them briefly. They're like these chemical tags that attach to our genes that turn things on and off. And so various things that occur, like very, very big impacts, environmental insults, if you will, can be, felt within our lifetime and, shown physically within our lifetime, as well as our children's lifetime and our grandchildren's lifetime. So one big, big example that everybody loves to talk about is the Dutch hunger famine. So the Dutch hunger famine, specifically when we talk about epigenetics, happened in 1944 to 1945. There was a German blockade that essentially blocked a lot of the food supply to a region in the Netherlands. So what happened is that children conceived during this time, they experienced persistent health effects even 6 generations later. And this is that epigenetic inheritance that happened just because of reductions in this food supply while they were in utero, while they were in mom's tummy. So these included big metabolic conditions. So obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, increased risk of all of these, or increased incidence of all of these metabolic ailments. And one of the big culprits that people talk about is decreased DNA methylation. I'm not going to, let's just talk about DNA methylation as one of these marks that attach to these genes that turn things on or off. And this was like a key imprinted gene. And so, these are all heritable. And so when we talk about eating disorders, these change in the gene expression without changing the genetic sequence itself could be things like preterm birth, which could increase an individual's risk factor of having an eating disorder. Birth trauma, so those are a variety of different things. The season of birth also seems to have an influence. Adverse life events, so again, we could talk about sexual abuse, a car accident, somebody dying. Very, very big of life events can have a long-term implication. The other two are that I'm just going to talk about is change in dietary intake, so that restrictive or overconsumption, as well as puberty.
Wow. Okay. So you're saying that things that happen in our physical or social environment then either can impact those genes to either turn on or off in a way that sort of triggers the onset of anorexia.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Hmm.
And so then what is the, I guess, then what's the impact potentially the other way around? Then how does the ongoing eating disorder symptoms, how does that then impact the body, or in your studies, like gut microbiome and our biological health?
Yeah, so there's a number of different things that we can discuss specifically from a metabolic perspective. In cases like bulimia nervosa, this bulimia specifically, when we talk, I feel like we should define the three before we really get into it, because maybe there's also, a misunderstanding when it comes to anorexia and bulimia.
Mm-hmm.
Anorexia itself is a BMI of less than 18.5. That is a very underweight BMI. And whereas bulimia is a BMI of over 18.5. Both both of these conditions could have this binge and purge uh, you know action or behavior. So anorexia is not just restrictive eating. There's two types. It's restrictive eating versus binge and purge, but it's just this maintenance of this BMI of less than 18.5 and this constant reduction in weight. Whereas bulimia is anything over 18.5 and this binge and purge, and that could be purging via vomiting, self-induced vomiting, or laxative abuse. But they typically maintain a weight and it's over 18.5, as opposed to binge eating. And binge eating is the other one, and that's eating with lack of control, with the absence of compensatory behaviors. So just binging, no purging, no restrictive dieting or anything like that. And all three have a very drastic lifetime prevalence. So they range, of course. Anorexia is about 0.9% in women and 0.3% in men. And actually, in Canadian women specifically, they're 10 times more likely to develop the disease than men. Although, maybe take that with, a grain of salt, because it's believed that anorexia is normally a female disease. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's less diagnosed in men, specifically ethnic men, because they're not perceived as the typical anorexia patient. So things that happen when we talk about bulimia, there's a lot of like maladies, if you will. So in the digestive tract, you'll see things like Mallory-Weiss syndrome. So from purging itself, it results in tears in the esophagus, causing this gastrointestinal bleeding. You'll also see things like abdominal pain, vomiting, blood, either red or coffee ground in appearance, bloody or black stool. And you also see something known as acute gastric dilation. So what that is a sudden irreversible stretching of the stomach after this binge purging. You also see malnutrition, which leads to the weakening of the muscles of the GI tract, leading to slower movement of food along the GI tract, which then generally results in sharp abdominal pain and an abnormal enlargement of the abdomen. You also, in bulimic individuals, you'll see this swelling of salivary glands, and the reason for that is because a healthy individual, when they have to vomit, the body responds by overproducing saliva to lubricate the esophagus. And the reason for that is so that the acidity from the stomach doesn't burn through the esophagus. So with individuals who are purging regularly via self-induced vomiting, they're overproducing this saliva, which then results in these very, very enlarged parotid glands,
Oh.
which you can see in these patients as well. When it comes to anorexia, however, there's a few things we can discuss. One thing, the first thing we can discuss is bones. So with lower nutrient intake, anorexic individuals are more susceptible to osteoporosis. And what happens here is, just from a physiological perspective, these individuals are not able to matrix calcium, vitamin D, and phosphorus together. when that happens, it leads to the spongiform bony changes, which will lead to this increased incidence of fractures. And intuitively, it makes sense. When you see an anorexic individual, you can see that they're very thin and fragile, and their bony states might put them at higher risk of osteoporosis.
So they're actually breaking down because you're not getting enough nutrients in order to have those different calcium and other minerals come together to continue to maintain your bone health. So like you think like you could supplement that, but at the end of the day, is it that like food has to be a part of that? Because just like taking calcium pills probably doesn't remedy that.
So oftentimes, you have to take, if that's the go ahead. My impression of that is that you need multiple different minerals and vitamins, just because the absorptive state of those minerals require other minerals to actually be able to absorb into the body. So just because your body is lacking in calcium doesn't mean that it's actually going to absorb it if you ingest it. So if you take an iron, it's probably not going to be absorbed because you need vitamin C in order for it to be absorbed. So that's why you have to supplement the two together, but that's not typically advertised. So, and that applies to other nutrients as well.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got brittle bones. And so I've had my bone density tested a few times over the past several years. And I was in the normal range, and then I ended up dipping into, I think it's called osteopenia, which is, it's not full on osteoporosis deterioration, but it is this like, we're below normal and we should be doing something to rebuild this, is basically what it is.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very proud of you for constantly checking. So that's really great. Are there things that you are doing to improve it?
Yeah. So they sometimes have recommended either estrogen, right? Because it's like there's a hormonal element to it, but also like upping calcium and making sure that I'm getting enough of that. So yeah, it's part of like the supplementation process. But at the end of the day, they're literally if you're getting enough nutrients, you wouldn't have to worry so much about like, oh, is it enough calcium? It's like if you're overall eating enough and you're in a healthy body, then that should resolve, is what I've been told.
Yeah, I mean, but that's also very easy to say to somebody, right? So I'm not an eating disorders specialist. I focus on metabolism and genetics, but specifically from an eating disorder perspective, it's so complex. And even remedying one thing does not mean that it's going to fix the other. Or if you choose to remedy one thing, it could actually exacerbate other situations. And we can discuss that as well.
Okay.
But speaking of hormones, you're absolutely right. Typically, individuals with anorexia have decreased estrogen for sure. And, it doesn't impact your hormones and reproductive health very strongly, to the point where a lot of anorexic individuals experience something called amenorrhea. And amenorrhea is defined as the lack of period, or you miss a period for 3 months at a time.
And that's how you define amenorrhea.
Yeah. So normally we have this hormone known as GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this pathway, this GnRH pathway, GnRH is released from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is this region in the forebrain, which regulates the part of the nervous system responsible for the control of bodily functions. And that can include things like temperature, thirst, hunger, among other things. So GnRH is released from the hypothalamus, then it acts on another region of the brain known as the anterior pituitary, and that secretes this follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, as well as luteinizing hormone, or LH. And this then will affect menstruation. This is the normal pathway. This GnRH pathway eventually, causes menstruation. Okay. It's important that this GnRH is released in this pulsatile fashion in the pathway, otherwise it won't work. In anorexia, because the individual has decreased caloric availability and a BMI of less than 18.5, the hypothalamus physically can't release GnRH. So it shuts down the pathway entirely and eventually results in amenorrhea. And this is just a classic symptom of anorexia.
So there's
But
just
when we
not
talk,
enough food. There's just not enough energy for your literal part of your brain to release what it needs to release.
yeah, there's a lot of things that like cause the brain to not be able to function properly. So you mentioned refeeding. So like people have told you just eat this supplement or just eat well and like everything would better. That's not entirely super effective. Like it has to be in a very controlled environment, especially when somebody has reached a state of anorexia, like this very restrictive diet, because there's something called refeeding syndrome in the world of anorexia. Have you heard of that?
I
Refeeding
have heard
syndrome?
of it, and I was actually going to ask you about that because it's something I don't know enough about.
Okay. So refeeding syndrome, the individual is calorically restricted for a very long time. And then these, medical practitioners say, okay, let's give you this influx of food. First thing that happens is this significant increase in insulin, which in healthy individuals, that's fine. You eat food, insulin spikes, that's normal. That's normal physiological function. But in anorexic individuals, it's more problematic. The reason is when this happens, there's a very drastic increase in glycogen synthesis. And glycogen is how your body stores sugar from food in the liver and the muscle for use later. It's a protective mechanism. You want to store energy from food so that your organs can function even when you're not always eating, or you're going
Right.
for a run, or say you're a hunter gatherer and you're going for a few days to gather some food or berries or a new chicken, I don't
As hunter
know.
gatherers do.
Yeah.
Right. It's basically like this is
Right.
your tank. This is your gas tank of reserves for energy.
Totally. Yeah. So insulin, not only does it increase this glycogen synthesis or creation, it also increases fat synthesis and protein synthesis. That's just this normal function. But in order to do this, the body also has to use electrolytes. The key electrolytes that it needs to use is potassium, magnesium, and phosphorus. Now, if the anorexic individual already doesn't have very much electrolyte stored in their system, and all of a sudden they're refeeding so rapidly, there's a huge increase in insulin. All of a sudden, there's boom, 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 increased glycogen, increased protein synthesis, increased fat synthesis. In order to do this, it's depleting the electrolytes. That can be very, very problematic because what do electrolytes do? So let's talk about potassium as the first one. So potassium, too little potassium or too much potassium can both be very, very bad. The reason is that it can lead to cardiovascular events. It could literally stop your heart, or it can have like heart failure effects. When it comes to magnesium depletion, it can result in muscle spasms, exhaustion, tremors. When it comes to phosphorus depletion, phosphorus reduces something called ATP. So, grade 10 biology, just try to go back to that. ATP is known as adenosine triphosphate, and it's this energy containing molecule found in all the cells of the body. And it's critical for proper organ function. So without it, things start to shut down. So the brain, which uses the most energy in the body, it can start experiencing things like seizures, or the heart, for example, it can shut down, and there can be a heart attack incident, et cetera, et cetera. So this refeeding syndrome is a very, very serious syndrome. So when it comes to individuals with eating disorders, specifically anorexia nervosa, it needs to be taken seriously in a controlled environment. And in my opinion, it also cannot stop too soon, because there's oftentimes this revolving door pattern, and we can talk about that from like a genetic perspective as well.
Okay, so essentially you think, oh, this person is starving, this person is so underweight, feed them, feed them, feed them, feed them. But if you do it too quickly at too high of a level, it actually just knocks all of their electrolytes and these things out of whack and ends up having these really problematic consequences. So that's why like medical supervision is so important in the early phases of
Absolutely.
recovery.
Absolutely. Yep, for sure.
Say something about that revolving door concept that you're talking about.
Yeah, so going back to that paper about genetics and those linkages, in a medical context, the refeeding and trying to increase weight. So that's a very big output. Like that's what the objective is not only just to go back to eating, but also increasing the weight of individuals who are anorexic. So again, a BMI of less than 18.5, there has been shown that anorexia has a negative correlation with BMI, of course, and percent body fat, but there's a genetic link to that. So individuals who want to gain weight, so say as yourself, you want to gain weight physically, but it's highly likely that you have these genes that are preventing you from doing that. So oftentimes with the anorexic individuals, there are these genes that are connected with leanness, if you will. So even though you want to gain weight, your body naturally wants to stay lean. So it does so. And so, and there's also like bacteria in the gut that also are increased in anorexic individuals that are also associated with leanness. So in the hospital setting, do not leave too soon because chances are your weight is going to decrease again. And this anorexic behavior, this disorder will continue. Leaving too soon, even when you're starting to do well, should not be the only measure.
Right. So, okay. So you reach a certain weight and they think, okay, you're fine. You've like reached this BMI, but there's also these other factors that are working against you physically, not just mentally, to maintain that weight restoration and then keep you coming. That's what you mean by revolving door. It's like in and out of the hospital. Cause we see that pattern like in people that are trying to recover over and over, is that they kind of go in and then out and then in and then out. And it's all of these multiple hospitalizations because it's basically like you've left too soon or you haven't had the support network to kind of continue that maintenance to a place where you're more stable. Does that gut bacteria that, is correlated with the leanness or genes, does that heal? Does that resolve with sustained feeding?
Yeah, so provided that there is sustained feeding, those bacteria will maintain themselves. But if there's this revolving door concept, the individual will stop eating, so the individual will not have that bacteria persist. The bacteria depends on that, the feeding.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
This is so amazing. So there's obviously a breadth of physical issues and symptoms that are a result of the restriction and the anorexia. Maybe we can move into something a little bit more hopeful. Like, this is obviously terrifying and so risky. And I think it's so important to talk about these very literal physical things that happen to you. Is this reversible? Like, is this permanent damage? Or can this be reversed?
So, I mean, from the research, it seems that the biggest success stories are individuals who they have to really want it, because it's not easy. It cannot be an influence from somebody else needing them to regain some weight or be more healthy, etc. It has to be an innate drive that they want to put in the work, because it will be a long road to recovery. Because again, there's a lot of forces working against somebody with an eating disorder. There's the genetics, there's the epigenetics, there's the environment, there's exposures that have occurred throughout their lifetimes, there's exposures that have occurred through parents' lifetimes, both mom and dad. In certain cases, there's exposures that have occurred 6 generations prior. There has to be this drive and this great support system in place from a clinical setting as well as a personal and social setting that will allow recovery and facilitate that for sure.
And what happens to metabolism when stuff starts coming back online in recovery? Because you mentioned that everything slows down, both with bulimia and with anorexia, because it's basically eating away at your muscles that facilitate your digestive tract to even work properly. How does metabolism and the gut microbiome, how does that start to come back?
So So when we talk about the gut microbiome and anorexia, there are actually only 9 studies on the alterations in the microbiota with patients with anorexia, and only 2 case studies with fecal microbial transplants. So there's not a whole lot when it comes to the gut microbiota and anorexia, but I do think that there's a lot that is going to be moving forward in this area. So
Mhm.
just to define the microbiome. So the microbiome is the millions of bacteria, archaea, fungi, and viruses that live in your gut. You're kind of from human cells to microbial cells, it's actually like approximately 1 to 1. So the theory is that every time you go to the bathroom, this is a joke that microbiologists like to say. The theory is that every time you go to the bathroom, you become more human.
I appreciate a science joke. I can appreciate that.
Thank you. There's not many, but they exist. There's also 2,000 microbial species specifically, and the personal combination of each individual has like very unique 500 species. So actually, some people would argue that your poop sample, your microbial sample from your fecal matter is your fingerprint. It's like a fingerprint. It's very, very specific to every individual. And there are a lot of different things that affect the composition of the microbiome. Genetics is one of them. Illnesses is another. Medication, stress, exercise, and past experiences like birth mode. So were you born via cesarean section versus vaginal birth? Were you breastfed or were you formula fed? Did you have past illnesses? Did your mom or did you use antibiotics in infancy? These are all major contributors. The biggest one, and estimation is about 50 to 60% is actually influenced from nutrition. So there's a lot to be said about how much your nutrition can influence your microbiome. And so in a lot of case studies and a lot of association studies, et cetera, the intervention with nutrition does show a drastic change on the microbiome within 2 days. And then it persists throughout the intervention, but it naturally wants to bounce back. So if you do not feed it, if you don't constantly feed it, it's going to bounce back to its original state because, it needs to be fed, right?
Right, right. Okay, so if you're not, I guess, quote unquote, maintaining your microbiome by feeding it the right food, then what kind of things would you see happen?
Well, so you see something known as a reduction in alpha diversity. So this is when I talk about alpha diversity, I have this example. So everybody's seen The Lion King. I like movies apparently,
This
so
is
I always
perfect.
like
This
things
is
to.
perfect. It's like take science and make it Disney. I'm like, perfect. Now I can understand where we are.
Maybe I should do that with all my other concepts. Everything has to go back to Disney.
Yes.
So in The Lion King, the beginning of the movie, Mufasa and Simba, so Mufasa is the rightful king. He's this keystone species, if you will, and there's so much diversity in the land. So you see so much color and beautiful nourishment, like everything's green, everything's fed. You see zebras and elephants and, you know, chimpanzees and all the different colors, all the different flora and fauna. But then halfway through the movie, Scar takes over and the hyenas. There's only 2. There's one lion and a bunch of hyenas. And so that there is bad situations. Let's call Scar the bad bacteria. So like a virus or a really, really crappy bacteria. That influences the proliferation or the increase of very select bacteria that are also not good for you. So they're not beneficial to the host. So that's what generally happens. So in an anorexic individual or individuals with eating disorders, you see a reduction in this alpha diversity. So the movement from a very diverse, wonderful gut to a non-diverse gut. And so that becomes very, very metabolically draining. You're no longer seeing the greenery in the Lion King. You're seeing just darkness. Everything is used up. Everything is dying. That's what you typically see. And that decrease in diversity also affects the rest of your organs. So bacteria in the gut influence, the liver or the heart or the brain, especially. There's this gut brain axis that everybody talks about. And that can affect a number of different things, including harvesting energy from food. So bacteria actually can harvest energy from food. They have that capability. Also, body weight composition. It can influence fat mass. It could also influence other body composition. In some papers, they've also influenced bone mineral density and concentration. But it can also influence mood. So it can influence depression and anxiety behavior, etc. So when there's a reduction in this bacteria, it can have a very bad outcome on the rest of the body.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So you've got basically the perfect storm. Let's say that that part of the contributing factor to your eating disorder in the first place is higher levels of anxiety. And then you're using food as a coping mechanism. And so then you're restricting, and then you end up with an eating disorder. And then you've messed up your gut microbiome, which then feeds into anxiety in and of itself. Like, no wonder this is a difficult cycle to get out of. Maybe say more about the brain and microbiome connection, the like gut brain.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of data that has been coming out specifically on the gut brain axis. Recently, there's been this association with anorexia and the gut brain axis. And actually, they're calling it the microbiota gut brain axis now to involve the bacteria as well. And so actually anorexia from a scientific perspective, especially when we're talking about rodent models, it's regarded as a model, like a great model for studying the interaction of nutrition and the gut brain axis, because it's that reduction in nutrition, reduction in bacteria. You can link it to specific things in the brain, which, when you deplete the bacteria in the gut, you can, and then refeed it specific bacteria, you can link different metabolic outcomes or depression, anxiety, etc. That's that concept of the germ-free model. But anorexia nervosa is also a great model for that as well. And what we're seeing is, again, the gut microbiota influences things like energy extraction from food and body weight gain, as well as appetite, gut permeability, even inflammation in the gut. So that immune response and complex psychological behaviors like depression and anxiety. And they all play a role, like you said, in anorexia. And in doing so, it influences the neurotransmitters. So when we talk about the gut brain axis, to paint you a picture, there is this nerve. It's actually two nerves on the right and the left. It's called the vagus nerve. And it goes from the brain all the way to the heart. And it also goes to the lungs, and it goes to that digestive tract as well. So that's that direct link to the digestive tract. And what we're seeing is that there's this direct link to these psychiatric diseases. There's, again, not as many papers when it comes to the gut brain axis, but we know that this is a great place to start to challenge some of the symptoms of anorexia, including depression and anxiety. That's a major symptom, and they are linked to some genetic and epigenetic susceptibilities as well. So if we can manipulate, say, the microbes in the gut to influence depression and influence anxiety, say, like to increase serotonin stores, to have an impact on these disorders by manipulating the gut microbiome, perhaps that could be a therapeutic measure. Having said that, I will never say, as a gut microbiologist, I love to say, oh, the gut microbiome is, everything. That's how you fix everything. That's a little naive. It's not actually true. You should try to manipulate the gut microbiome with various probiotics, and we need to find out which bacteria are decreasing or increasing because of these eating disorders. But it also needs to be combined with other therapies and perhaps other drugs. And that seminal paper that came out in 2019 in Nature Genetics, I think by the identification of those 8 specific regions on those chromosomes, I think that provides a lot of promise into targeting these specific genes using some pharmaceuticals for help as well in the future. And actually, one person sent me a paper that came out 8 days ago out of Peter Turnbau's lab at the University of California, San Francisco. And they're actually starting this gene editing, like CRISPR gene editing with the bacteria itself. So you can, instead of these probiotics, you can manipulate things, CRISPR gene editing. I mean, they're not there yet, but that's the theory, that they would be able to just increase or select for which bacteria should be in a healthy gut. So the application could also go to individuals with eating disorders as well.
Wow. As like an actual treatment because it's so
Yeah,
influential on the way that the rest of the
totally.
system works.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Also, a lot of psychotherapy as well.
Yes,
As a basic
that
scientist, I
I'm more
always
than
don't
familiar
mention
now.
it,
I'm like
but
that
yeah.
part I'm well versed in. I'm like I
Yeah,
don't know a lot about the gut microbiome, but therapy I do know a thing or three about. So yeah, it seems like no matter what we're doing physically, it always has to be used in really mindful conjunction with psychotherapy, good support system, because it isn't enough to just act on, like you said at the very beginning, it's not just psychological, it's not just metabolic, it's all of these different things. And so if they're all impacting us in the way that got us into the eating disorder, they all need to be addressed in what's going to hopefully get us out of it.
totally, absolutely. And I think, in an ideal world, and I think I've always said this when it comes to like medical practice, there has to be this interdisciplinary approach to a lot of or metabopsychiatric diseases like anorexia. It cannot be just one size fits all. It can't be just a drug. It has to be approached from various angles, including psychotherapy and metabolic therapy and endocrinology and a bunch of different things in order to really get to the bottom of this and have a very wholesome therapeutic approach and be very effective.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate this. So I have learned, I am just like sitting here wide-eyed, just listening to all of this because it's such incredible, valuable information. I did have one somewhat random question for you because I was researching your research. I was looking at all of your publications, which I'm going to like shamelessly plug and put in the show notes and things like that. Cause it's just like, there's so much of it, but you've done some studies on like artificial sweeteners. And that piqued my interest because that is something that I have used and abused for a very long time, where it's like, because you try to cut calories, you don't want to have sugar. So you end up having all of these artificial sweeteners. And I was almost afraid to go and look at what was found about them, but maybe you can tell me a little bit about that research and scare me out of using this.
Do you want me to scare you? Like,
Yeah,
I don't.
I think it's
Okay.
important to know the realities of what the use around these things are, because that it seems like also even outside of just eating disorder recovery, just like the world in general, it's like, some people are like, well, aspartame will kill you, or like stevia is totally fine for you. And the fact that I'm talking to you and you've actually done some real studies about this, I'd be so curious to know what are the impacts of using these artificial sweeteners.
So yeah, great question. So I will say one, if you want me to scare you, it's not really a scaring thing, but what I find with human beings in general is that they often care less about themselves, but care more about others. And I know you well, Maddie, you're an amazing human. I love you very much. And I know that you care more about others than perhaps you do yourself. And so what we talk about in the gut microbiome world, what in an approach to tell kids to eat their broccoli or eat their very high fiber dense foods, we tell them to feed these awesome bacteria that's in your belly because otherwise they'll die, they'll starve. That's that. And then they're like, okay, cognitively, I hate this. I hate this broccoli. I'm not going to eat it. I don't want to eat it, but I got to do it for my pets in my tummy. People also like get exercise because they don't want it, but they want to walk their dog. In the case of artificial sweeteners, it's not the impact on the individual, and in this case it would be the impact on mom, which is what this paper was about. It's that what happens is that the artificial sweeteners, both aspartame and stevia, seem to show an increase in body fat in their offspring, and it also had long-term implications as well. So it impaired their glucose tolerance. And so when we talk about impaired glucose tolerance, we always talk about how that can eventually lead to type 2 diabetes and other metabolic dysregulation. So perhaps you're not seeing it, you won't see it in yourself, but you're affecting your offspring. And this paper is specifically focused on during gestation, so while mom was pregnant,
Right.
and this was in rats as well. So But if that's the scary aspect that
That's
you want, that's what it is.
interesting.
Mhm.
See, and that's because and that's the thing too, is that it is really hard, I think, to fully appreciate what the long-term impacts of this can be. And until something is literally happening to you in the moment, it's very easy to say, well, that's not impacting me. Like I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. Because we feel so far away from our future selves. And we don't always do a great job. Like I don't do a great job of looking after future Maddie. If I had, I probably wouldn't be here where I am if I'd been thinking about today Maddie 10 years ago. But the reality is that if then you can kind of put a bit of a face to that future self, or in the case of having future offspring, imagining that the things and the choices that you're making will impact them, that's actually a really powerful psychological tool. As you said, even and the same thing, little kids feeding their gut microbiome. I feel like that would be a great way for me to frame things. Like I'm feeding my flora and I don't want Scar to take over. I'd much rather have a beautiful, like Mufasa type of savanna living in my belly. That's something that I'm going to use. I think I'm going to think about using this as a mental trick.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah, exactly. I'm glad to hear it for sure. But I also want to tell you, Maddie, I am so proud of you. Like, this is not an easy thing to do. Anorexia is a very, very difficult disorder it's very multifactorial. You cannot blame yourself. Like, it's absolutely not you. There's a lot of things and a lot of forces that you cannot physically control. But the fact that you're moving forward and you're taking all these steps, I don't know if you're sharing them on your podcast, but you're taking all these amazing, powerful steps to really take control of your life. I think that's so amazing and so strong-willed. So I think you need to put that somewhere, that you are strong-willed, Maddie, and you're gonna get over this. You are going to recover. We're all on your side. All of your friends are here cheering you on, for sure. And if you're ever feeling low, just call one of us. We'll pump you up, promise.
Oh, yes, that's like the absolute best. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate that, and I take that to heart. And yeah, that means the world. And what an amazing opportunity for me to understand more about you and what you do and all of your brilliance at the same time. So this has been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I can't wait for the rest of the world to hear it.
Thank you, darling. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So that was my conversation with Faye, Dr. Chleilat, a dear friend and absolutely brilliant mind in the space of nutrition, metabolism, genetics. And as you heard, there's a ton to digest, I guess, out of that conversation. But I will link Faye's work in the show notes, and you can connect with her if you like to. Just a reminder, there is also the Q&A coming up that's going to be recorded, so you can keep submitting your questions either through DMs or on the form on the website. I've gotten some really, really cool questions so far, so I'm really excited to record that one. Again, if you like this podcast, please rate and review it on Apple or wherever it is that you're listening. It makes an absolute world of difference, and hopefully we can get some really good exposure to these conversations, because I'm hearing that people are finding them helpful, and that really means a lot. So thanks for being here, and we will see you on the next